Sonic X Shadow Generations has been out for a couple of weeks now, and I'm sure we can all agree that these are both fantastic games. But which one is better? Like, I know I said in my review that I liked Shadow Generations better than Sonic Generations, but after replaying Sonic Generations, I found it to be way more fun than I remembered. So, in this video, we will compare the two games in 8 different categories to see which is better in each aspect. Now, just a disclaimer here, these are 100% my opinions. So, if you disagree, then that's completely fine. I just wanted to make this video to talk about each game's highs and lows. But before we dive in, let's hear a word from today's sponsor. Marvel Strike Force is a mobile squad RPG where you assemble teams of Marvel superheroes and villains, including but not limited to Iron Man, Wolverine, and Venom, to battle threats like Doctor Doom and Apocalypse. Players unlock and upgrade characters to tackle game modes such as Campaign, Arena Blitz, and PvP modes like Alliance War and Cosmic Crucible. New players can unlock up to 17 characters in their first 30 days, including Spider-Man and Thor. Strategy is key in this game as you pair heroes and villains for synergies in 5v5 battles. With new characters and game modes regularly released, the game's meta constantly evolves. Listen, I'm not even the biggest fan of mobile RPGs, but Marvel Strike Force is an exception, as it is a blast being able to play as your favorite characters from across the Marvel universe. The countless modes the game offers are just loads of fun, which is why I cannot wait for the new Battle World game mode, which is releasing really soon. To celebrate the spooky season, you can also redeem the promo code Halloween to receive 100 shards for Zombie Iron Man, 600k gold, and 480 L2 training modules for absolutely free. So, what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen to play Marvel Strike Force today. And thank you so much to Marvel Strike Force for sponsoring this video. Let's start with the presentation. This includes graphics, animations, polish, sound design, art style, and everything that makes the game look nice. Now, polish is actually pretty rare in Sonic games. Ever since the Adventure days, most Sonic games lacked significant polish. This didn't necessarily make or break the games by any means, but it was noticeable. However, both Sonic and Shadow Generations are very well polished. Even back when Generations first launched in 2011, there weren't any glitches or bugs for the most part. The animation also looks significantly good for the budget the game was made with, and the UI design is some of the best in the entire series if you ask me. It just feels so Sonic, I guess you could say. So yeah, the presentation in Sonic Generations is outstanding, but I think Shadow Generations does it a little bit better. Since this is a newer game, it does look better. That's pretty much a given. The UI design is very similar to Sonic Generations, and there also aren't any considerable glitches or bugs, so I think both games are pretty equal in that aspect. But the one thing that sets Shadow Generations apart from Sonic Generations is the animation. Oh my god, dude. Shadow Generations has some of, if not the best animation we've seen in a Sonic game, second to maybe like Sonic Boom Rise of Lyric. I also just gotta talk about the cool cinematic moments that happen in Shadow Generations. Sonic Generations didn't have anything close to this. So overall, Shadow Generations gets the point for presentation. Next, let's talk about the story. And I don't think I have to talk about this too much because Shadow Generations definitely has the better story. But I don't think it's fair to completely discredit the Sonic Generation story just because it's not as interesting to me. For what the Sonic Generation story is trying to be, I think it's serviceable, but that's all the credit I can really give it. It's a pretty straightforward, boring narrative otherwise. Shadow Generations, on the other hand, has solid character development, good interactions between the characters, and a very intriguing and mysterious plot throughout its runtime. So yes, even though the Sonic Generation story is solid for what it's trying to be, I'm going to give the point to Shadow Generations for just being more interesting. Next up, we have the content of each game, mainly referring to the amount of content and how good it is. Listen, I agree with the whole idea of quality over quantity, but I think it's also important for a game to have some content for the player to enjoy outside of the main campaign, and I think both Sonic and Shadow Generations do a really good job at this. For Sonic Generations, we have 9 zones with 2 acts each, 7 bosses, and 90 challenge gates. There are also 5 red rings and 3 Chow to collect in each level. That's a lot of content, but the content in Sonic Generations does have some low points. Some of the challenges feel very bare bones and pretty similar to the actual act, and Planet Wisp is just not a very good stage all around if you ask me. Now, Shadow Generations Generations does have less content than Sonic Generations. We only have 6 zones with 3 collectibles in each act, 4 bosses, and 30 challenge gates. However, Shadow Generations also has much more to do in its hub world. Now look, making a beeline to the end of both games will take you around 2 to 3 hours apiece. But even with that, 100%ing Sonic Generations still took a little bit longer. And even though Shadow Generations is more consistent with its content, I think I have to give the point to Sonic Generations. Moving on to the level design. I'm going to split this category into 2 sections, one for 2D and one for 3D level design. Starting with the 3D stuff. Sonic Generations has fantastic level design in the modern stages. It's a very solid mix of high-speed reaction time elements and platforming. Now, Shadow Generations, while being much more puzzle solving and platforming focused than Sonic Generations, is much better if you ask me, mainly due to 2 reasons. The first reason is the variety. There are way more alternate pathways, hidden routes, and interesting set pieces in Shadow Generations. Sonic had this stuff too, don't get me wrong, but the problem with the 3D level design in Sonic Generations is that there's not much of it. The 3D in Sonic only takes up around 30% of the game, while Shadow has a much more even split between 2D and 3D. Every Act 1 in Shadow Generations is completely 3D, and that's great as it allows for more unique level design. But since Sonic Generations constantly switched to 2D, even in the 3D levels, Shadow Generations gets the point here. But I think it's fair to talk about 2D level design too, because Sonic Generations has 2 separate gameplay styles for 2D stuff. Both the classic acts and the modern 2D segments in Sonic Generations share similar design aspects, and it's all really good stuff. It feels coherent, there's a lot of variety, and above all, it's all really fun. Now, for Shadow Generations, I do think the 2D stuff is the low point of the game. It just feels too slow for my liking, and the level design, while still having variety for the most part, doesn't feel nearly as coherent as I think it should. There are a lot of moments in the 2D levels that feel half-baked and unfinished. Sunset Heights Act 2 is a great example of this. The level just feels very inconsistent in terms of quality. The sewer sections are cool, I like those a lot, but the sections with all of the platforms just don't do it for me. I also don't like Rail Canyon Act 2 and Chaos Island Act 2 for the same reasons. They just feel way too gimmicky, and they're just not very fun in my opinion. So, Sonic Generations gets the point here. Now we move on to the overall gameplay and controls of each game. And you know what, man? This is very difficult. Both games have fantastic controls and gameplay, but they each have their highs and lows. Sonic Generations has extremely fast gameplay, but as a trade-off, Sonic is much stiffer to control. Shadow Generations is the opposite because Shadow has much more responsive movement, but he's way slower than Sonic. So what it comes down to is if I prefer the gameplay gimmick of classic Sonic or the gameplay gimmicks of the Doom powers and Chaos control. Now, after thinking long and hard about this, I gotta give Shadow Generations the point. It's damn close though, don't get me wrong, but I do think the Doom powers give Shadow Generations that extra bit that makes it the better game in this aspect. Moving on to the bosses, and yeah, Shadow Generations wins this one too. I'm not saying that the Sonic Generations bosses are bad because they're not. They're still really fun. But the main thing that sets apart both boss fights for me at least is the challenge. Sure, the Shadow Generations bosses are easy, but they offer much more replayability than the Sonic Generations bosses. Some of these bosses took me multiple attempts to S rank, and I had fun replaying them on every attempt. But with Sonic Generations, some of the bosses in that game just feel like a chore to get through. They have nothing that makes me want to come back and replay them. And of course, Shadow Generations has the awesome cinematography and QuickTime events too. So yeah, Shadow Generations gets the point. Finally, we have the soundtracks. Now, don't get me wrong, Shadow Generations has a pretty solid soundtrack, but only half of it is good if you ask me. Most of the Act 2 tracks in Shadow just don't sound that good if you ask me, especially Chaos Island Act 2. Sonic Generations has a much better soundtrack throughout the entire game. Now, it still has some low points, like Planet Wisp Act 1, but it's much more consistent than Shadow Generations. Alright, so after all of that, the clear winner here is Shadow Generations, beating Sonic Generations 5-3. So yeah, even though both of these games are great in their own ways, I do think Shadow Generations is the better experience overall. But even though Shadow Generations is better in my opinion, I still think that Sonic X Shadow Generations is one of the best Sonic packages out there. It includes 2 of the greatest Sonic games ever made, but that's just my opinion. Let me know which game you like better in the comments down below, and what points of mine do you agree or disagree with. I would love to hear your thoughts. But that's all for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all later. Goodbye.